Today's daf is daf Yud Gimel, and we'll start where we left off. Amar Le. So we'll count down from the top of the Amud, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down. Amar Le, and this is a discussion between Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now, just to refresh our memory, so we'll have a soft takeoff, so to speak. Rabbi Yirmiyah had asked Rabbi Zera, what happens if a person is penalized as a result of the fact that his malacha was mechuvenes l'chol hamoed. In other words, he initially had scheduled his work on chol hamoed. And the law is that he gets penalized and he's not allowed to benefit at all from that malacha because he had violated the law and organized it and scheduled it up front for chol hamoed. What's the status in the case of a person who violated the law, died? Does the penalty continue and impact on his son? Does the son, in a sense, inherit that penalty such that he's not allowed to benefit from the malacha? Is he responsible for the action of his father? And now Rabbi Zera, in response to Rabbi Yirmiyah's question, says, Bisura. Let's derive it from a Mishnah in Masechet Shvius. The Mishnah says, Sada sheniskavta b'shvius. So there are thorns in the field. The thorns are detached. They're not growing. So therefore, he's not doing a malacha d'oraisa in the karka, in the field itself. So therefore, in worst case scenario, when he gathers and clears out these thorns, he's violating only an Isur D'Rabbanan. And the question is, what penalty and what is the scope of the penalty in a case where he violated this Isur D'Rabbanan and he did a malacha during Shvius? And the Mishnah establishes that Tizar L'Motzoi Shvius, that during the course of Shvius itself, he's not going to benefit from it. He violated only a D'Rabbanan. And therefore, in this case, he can benefit immediately after Shvius. We don't impose a penalty, which we would do if he violated a Meleches Karka D'Oraisa during Shvius, if he had cleared by pulling out thorns from the ground. Here in this case, he didn't pull out the thorns from the ground. He only gathered the thorns, which is a violation of a D'Rabbanan. It looks like he's improving the karka, and the Rabbanan prohibited it, but they didn't impose a penalty such that he wouldn't be allowed in the following year, after Shvius, during the 8th year, to benefit from the karka. Nityava or Nidaira. If, let's say, for example, in those days, what they did is they brought the animals into a field or part of the field in order to fertilize the field. The animals would defecate, and that would be fertilizer for the field. And in this case, he violates, if he does this during Shvius, by deliberately bringing the animals into his field on Shvius and improving the karka for fertilization, then he violates a d'oraisa, and as a result, he's penalized lo tizra l'motzi shvius. He's not allowed to plant the field and benefit from the fertilization that he violated, and therefore he's not allowed to enjoy the benefit of it the following year. Now, here we have a discussion about bringing the animals into the pen. Is that actually a violation of d'oraisa? In truth, he didn't do any action directly with his hands in the karka. He brought the animals into his field. The Rabbanan asked it. It's not a d'oraisa. And the Rabbanan are not going to allow him to benefit by planting the field and benefiting from the fertilization that was provided illegally when he brought the animals into his field. So that on the one hand, in the case of gathering together the thorns, that was called in that case, there was no penalty imposed, because in this case, since everything is already detached, although he's not allowed to gather it together, but nevertheless, it's not something that has a powerful, profound impact on the agricultural success of his growing in the field. Therefore, there was no penalty. But in the case of fertilization, there's apparently a very immediate and profound impact on the field and its potential for production, productivity, and therefore the Rabbanan imposed a penalty on him. He's not allowed to sow his field the year after he brought the animals in during Shvius to fertilize the field. The Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, Naktina. Naktina means we have a Kabbalah from earlier generations. Heitiva umes, if he fertilized the field and then he died, beno zora. We're not going to impose the penalty of the father on the son if the father dies. It was the father who violated the Isur D'Rabbanan of Melecha Shvius by bringing the animals into the field. If the father is alive, he's not allowed to benefit from that fertilization by planting in the 8th year, but we're not going to extend that penalty and apply it to the son. Alma. So the Gemara says we can see from this, and this was what Rav Zera's answer was to Rav Yirmiyah, that l'didei konsu Rabbanon, libre lo konsu Rabbanon. That when the Rabbanon impose a penalty on someone who violated the law, for example, in the case we brought in his animals during Shvius to fertilize the karka, we don't extend and impose that penalty on the son. The son is not guilty for his father's transgressions. And by process of analogy, in the case where a person was machavin malachta l'moed, he deliberately scheduled his work for chol hamoed, he himself is penalized, he's not allowed to benefit from that work. However, that penalty is not going to be passed on via Yerusha to the son. And that's called the didei konsu Rabbanan libre lo konsu Rabbanan. Al-Chinami here too, in the case of someone who scheduled his work for Chol Hamoed, l'didei konsu Rabbanan libre lo konsu Rabbanan. Abai wants to further support this conclusion that the knas is only applicable to the father, not extended to the son. Aktinon, we have again a tradition that was passed down, transmitted through the generations, that timei taros of mes. Now we're getting into the sugya of nezikin, and specifically what's called a hezek she'eno nikar. If a person takes someone else's food, Ruvain takes Shimon's food that's tar, and he deliberately and actively contaminates it by putting a sheretz on top of the food, for example, and that's called a hezek she'eno nikar. It's not a physical damage, but nevertheless, try to sell your food on the market after it became tameh, you'll get a fraction of the price. And now we have a knas, and that is that we penalize the person who deliberately contaminated the taros of his friend, and we make him pay damages. He has to compensate him, even though it's a hezek she'eno nikar. But nevertheless, lo kontu but no achrot. His son, if in the event that the father died, and now in the estate he inherits money, that money is not meshubad, is not leaned to pay the penalty, the knas of its father. In other words, when it's a chiyuv mamon, which is called a shibud, that shibud is in the karka, it's inherent in the karka, and the yorshim now inherit the karka with a shibud on it, and that shibud is collectible by the balchov, by the creditor, by the creditor. But in the case of hezek she'eno nikar, there's no shibud in the karka. There's only a special knas that you have to pay. That's called a shibud haguf, not a shibud nechasim. And a shibud haguf is not transferred over to the son. So after the father dies, that the payment of that compensation cannot be collected. My time, hezek she'eno nikar lo shmei hezek. which means that even though the Rabbanan penalized him, but it's really not Nezikin and there's no Shibud in the Karka that would be passed on to the Yorshim. L'dinei Konsu Rabbanan, Libre Lo Konsu Rabbanan. And we see, therefore, that a penalty is not transferred over to the son, the Yerusha. And the same thing should apply here in the case of somebody who deserves a penalty because he deliberately scheduled his work for Chol HaMoed. That penalty is not going to be imposed on his son in event that he dies. The Mishnah says, Ein lochim batim avodim ubehema. We're talking about buying all sorts of merchandise. We have a number of categories here. We've got batim, and we have avodim, and we have behem. So mekach umemkar, buying and selling, is prohibited on Chol HaMoed. It's called uvda dechol. If he doesn't need it for Yontif, it's not l'tzarech Yontif. For example, the slave is not serving him on Yontif. The animals are not going to be slaughtered as food on Yontif. Then it's also to buy and sell these items on Chol HaMoed. El l'tzarech HaMoed. Now the Mishnah adds another leniency besides tzarech HaMoed, and that's a financial consideration. Oh, l'tzarech HaMocher she'ein lo mayoch. The seller is very desperate. He doesn't have anything to eat. We'll see what that means in just a second. And he needs this sale very badly. With the monies that accrue to him from the sale, he's able to buy food, he's able to eat, and he's able to experience Yontif. And here we have an insight of the Mordechai. The Ritva also quotes it, that we shouldn't take the Mishnah literally. Ein lo mayochal means he's dying of starvation. That would be pikuach nefesh. Then he's allowed to violate even the Nisa Doraisa. But rather it means that he doesn't have enough money to enjoy Yontif and buy delicacies for Yontif. And that also is considered litzarech hamoed, and therefore this is permitted on Chol HaMoed in order to guarantee that he has the funds that he needs to enjoy the simcha of Yontif. And the mitzvah of simcha applies all the days of Yontif, including Chol HaMoed. I love this stuff. This is so beautiful. Schar pa'ula means the schar of a poel she'ein lo mayochal ma'u. What about the following case? And I hire a worker on Chol HaMoed, which is normally prohibited, in a situation where the worker himself has no wages, he has no other jobs, he's jobless, and he needs the payment of his wages in order to buy delicacies for Yontif. In other words, the Mishnah speaks about the fact that the seller is in a situation of Ein lo mayochal. What if the laborer is Ein lo mayochal? You know, he's sitting there on the corners there, waiting for someone to hire him, and he's literally penniless. He can't buy what he needs for Yontif. On a moral level, we would say it should apply, but the Mishnah doesn't mention the case of a poel. Amalei. So Rav Nachman responds to Rava, Tanina, let's derive it from our Mishnah. And this is fascinating. The Gemara darshins the language of the Mishnah as if it was written in the Torah. If there's an extra word in the Mishnah, we can darshan from it. It's a reboot. It's coming to include something else. What does it say in the Mishnah? Oh, it's Tzorech HaMoed. You're allowed to buy and sell at Tzorech HaMoed. Now, certainly, if you need that money to come in so that you could buy food for Yom Tov, because otherwise you don't have the money for buying food, that's called Tzorech HaMoed. And yet the Mishnah adds the words, She'ein lo ma yochal. We understood She'ein lo ma yochal as implicit, included in L'tzorech HaMoed, right? L'tzorech HaMocher. So therefore, these words, quote, She'ein lo mayo chalasviye mayim. Why did the Mishnah feel compelled to add 4 extra words that are completely redundant? Lav, is it not so? Lasuye, it's coming to add and expand the heter to schar pu'ula. That even though you yourself, who are hiring a worker, you have no need for his pu'ula. In other words, it's not something that you need so badly for yontif, nor do you need a financial benefit coming from his pu'ula. But nevertheless, if he needs the schar pu'ula, and otherwise he will not be able to purchase that which he needs for yontif, that also is permissible, and that's derived from our Mishnah from the extra word she'ein lo mayoch. Despite that brilliant diuk of Rav Nachman, Rav is unimpressed. Why? Well, Perushe kamafarish. It's not that the words ein lo mayochel are coming to include a case that's not mentioned in the Mishnah, namely schar pu'ula, but rather the Mishnah is just explicating what it meant when it said litzarach hamocher. That litzarach hamocher means that he hasn't enough money to buy food to eat. But it has nothing to do with the leniency that you want to extend to hiring a worker who doesn't have enough money to buy food for himself. Abaye Sakash on Rava. What else is new, right? Ein kosvid shtarei chov b'moed. We have a Mishnah later on Daf Yud Ches that although we're not permitted to write legal documents, for example, a shtar chov means that if you borrow money from me, I want you to give me a shtar so that in event that you'll deny that you owe me the money, I'll pull out the shtar and it'll serve as a proof, as evidence that you owe me money. But we're not allowed to write that on Chol Moed. However, there are situations in which we will allow you to write the shtar on Chol Moed. Im eino ma'amino, he doesn't trust the lover. So in the absence of the shtar, one of two things is going to happen. Either the malva is going to extend the loan, but he's going to be very, very concerned and nervous about losing his money because the lover is going to bluff and deny the whole story. That's called Eino Ma'amino. Or alternatively, what might happen is the malva is going to decide when the lover comes and it's Chol Moed, he's going to say to him, I'm not, he won't say these words, but he's thinking these words, I'm not going to lend him money. I know that if I lend him money, it's like kissing the money goodbye because I don't have a shtar. Another case, we're going to allow writing a shtar on Chol Moed, o she'ein lo mayochal. If the lover who's coming, if the malva who's coming to extend the loan, he doesn't have enough money to eat, one second, do I have this right here? If the malva, no, it's got to be the lover. Just 1 second. Let me see if he has anything in the note. Oh, right. The lover doesn't have money to eat, so he's borrowing the money in order to eat. Oh. So it means the following, that if the malva doesn't trust the lover and the lover doesn't have money to buy food for yontif, so the malva is going to say, I'm not going to put what's called in the language of Shas Laniach as most Balkaren and Tzvi, I'm not going to extend you a loan. And then the lover is going to suffer because he doesn't have money in his pocket in order to buy food. Is a reza yichto. And once again, Abaye, just like Rav Nachman before him, just like who was it, Rav before him, is being medayik from the words she'ein lo mayochal lasuye mai. We already know that for the sake of tzarchei hamoed, you're allowed to write a shtar chov. Why did the Mishnah have to spell out she'ein lo mayochal lav lasuye schar pu'ula? It means that if somebody needs a job desperately, And if he doesn't get that job and he doesn't profit from the wages, he won't be able to buy food for Yontif, then certainly the Mishnah is telling me that that's also called Ein Lo Mayuchal, and therefore it's permissible. So that you can write a document on Chol HaMoed for the benefit of a loveh, and also you'd be allowed to hire a worker, pay him wages, schar pa'ula, if it's ein lo mayochel, if this wage earner has no job. So we're going to allow you to hire a worker on Chol HaMoed if he's a needy individual. Shmami. Most of Rav Sheshes is going to try to prove from a Mishnah in Psachim that we're not going to allow this kind of a setup, meaning a hiring, a matter of hiring on Chol HaMoed. Now, let's offer two introductions to this Gemara. Introduction number one is what's the status of Erev Pesach, the 14th of Nisan, as far as Malach is concerned. And here we split the day into two parts. From Chatzos and on, which is called Zman Pesach, there's an absolute universal Isur, nobody questions it, of Malach. We don't do Malach on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. We have to dedicate ourselves to the Korban Pesach, or today, to prepare the matzahs, the moror, and the seder, and everything else. But what about the first half of the day? From the morning until Chatzos Hayom. So the Mishnah in the fourth parak of Psachim establishes that that's totally the minhag. And those who have the minhag have extended the Isur Malacha of Erev Chol HaMoed, of Erev Pesach, from the afternoon all the way up to the morning. So with daybreak on the 14th of Nisan, according to this minhag, you're not allowed to do malach. That's Hakdama number one. Hakdama number two is that Rav Sheshes assumes an absolute equation between the Isur Malacha of the minhag of Erev Pesach and the Isur Malacha of Chol HaMoed. Whenever there's a heter on Chol HaMoed, and ipso facto, there'll be a heter even within the context of that city that has accepted the minhag of Isur Malacha in the morning of the 14th. And the Mishnah says in Psachim, Chachamim Omrim, Sholosh Umlios Osim Malacha B'Arvei Psachim An Chatzos. Even in a place where they have accepted the minhag to abstain from Malacha on the morning of the 14th, but for the sake of three categories of workers, we're going to allow those three categories of workers to do Malacha on Erev Pesach. Chayotim are tailors, Saparma barbers, and Kovsim are launderers. And the Bryce explains, Chayotim, Shekain Hejo Tofer Kedarko B'Chol HaMoed. Again, given the assumption that there's an equation between Chol HaMoed, Isur Malacha Chol HaMoed, and Isur Malacha by virtue of the meaning on Erev Yontif of Pesach, then just like on Chol HaMoed, we have a heter for Chayot. In a case of a hedgehog means he's not a professional sewer or weaver. He's allowed to sew kedarko without a shinu on Chol HaMoed. And therefore, ipso facto, whatever is mutar on Chol HaMoed is going to be mutar on Erev Pesach. Now, this is really interesting because the reason why we were matir on Chol HaMoed is because it's a meleches hedjot. The Mishnah Psachim says chayotim. I don't know, that seems, maybe I'm wrong about this. I know we have to really investigate this, but you get the impression that all chayotim, all tailors are mutter, even if he would do it in a skilled way. Oh, how do you like that? This is a Rashi Masechet Psachim. I didn't cheat. I didn't know that. He quotes it here in the note that on Erev Pesach, even a professional tailor would be allowed to, I can't read the next word, but it's allowed to do his thing, his prayer. Why? P-L-Y. I don't know. Do you know what the word P-L-Y means?
Yes.
Oh, to do. Okay. I'm not familiar with that word. It's a good word for Scrabble. I think you get a lot of points for a Y. Okay. Hasaparim Bakovs. So why were they matir malacha for a barber and a launderer on Erev Pesach? Because even on Chol Moed, we have situations in which we can allow barbering and laundering on Chol Moed, and that is for someone who comes from Medina Sayyam on a long trip. He was unable to cut his hair during that period of time, or Hayotzim Beis Hasurim, he was incarcerated. Mutarim l'saper l'chabes b'chol shel moed. I don't think I've ever actually seen this implemented, but that's how we pass in Shulchan Aruch. That there are cases where you're allowed to take a haircut on Chol Moed. You know about Yosef HaTzadik. Now, again, we're going beyond Chol Moed. We're saying that if on Chol Moed we have a situation, an ofen, in which it would be mutter, then these categories of workers are permitted on Erev Pesach. And it's almost like a Kal V'chomer. If Chol Moed, which is Doraisa, we were able to be matir all these cases, then how much more so on Erev Pesach, which in the morning is only a minhag, we could be makil, and not only that, we'll be makil even in a broader scope, even for the sake of someone who's not the Beis Hasurim, or he's not a Bar Medina Sayyam. Now we get to Rav Sheshes' kash. You're allowed to hire a worker so that he'll have wages to use the money to buy food for Chol Moed. For Moed is Kol Malachos Nami Lishtaru. According to your premise, we should be matir on Erev Pesach every single malacha. Why? Because in every case of a malacha, no matter what the malacha is, you could always say that on Chol Moed it would be mutter because of schar pa'ula. Da'ika schar pa'ula she'en lo mayochal. In other words, Rav Sheshes is really taking this to its logical conclusion, to the extreme. If you're going to tell me that this is mutter because of schar pa'ula, then on Erev Pesach, we should be matir everything. Why? Because we'll say that on Chol Moed it might be mutter in the case of schar pa'ula she'en lo mayochal. Maskif la Rav Papa. Elameyato, how far are you going to go with this equation between the Isser Minhag of Erev Pesach Malach and the Isser Malach of Chol Moed? Is Binyan Lishtrik, we should be permitted to build a house on Erev Pesach in the morning. Shekain Kosel Hagoya, I'll give you a situation in which on Chol Moed you're allowed to build a house. There's a leaning tower of Pisa, and it's very dangerous. The halacha is soser ubone kidarko mipnei sakona. We're going to allow you to take apart the house, tear it down, rebuild it in order to avoid a dangerous situation. Now, according to your logic of Sheshes, we should say that, any time that something is mutter on Chol Moed under whatever circumstances and conditions exist, then ipso facto it's mutter on Erev Pesach. Then building on Erev Pesach should be mutter because there are scenarios and situations in which on Chol Moed you're allowed to build. Maskif lo Ravina, another kash. Elameyato lav lo lishtere. A person who's a professional scribe, he should be allowed without any ifs, ands, or buts to do his writing on Erev Pesach. Shekain kosvin kiddushay nashim gitim v'cholrin. Because we have a Mishnah later on Daf Yud Ches that allows writing in the cases of Kiddushin, a Shtar Kiddushin, or a Shtar Gerushin, or Shovrin, which are receipts. And the Gemara is going to explain exactly why they were matir. But in any event, we see that there are situations in which you can have a professional scribe and he's allowed to write on Chol Moed. So then we should always allow a professional scribe to write on Erev Pesach. Ella, but rather you see that we cannot equate Chol Moed and Erev Pesach. And those three categories of workers that we allowed on Erev Pesach, that's for a different reason. Moed, our boss, Akaramis, don't ask me a kasha from Chol Moed to Yudal B'Nisan. There's no logic. There are two machayvim or two osrim. What's the osir on Chol Moed? It's mishum tirchahu, because he will be distracted. It'll be hesek hadas from simchas yontiv because of the excessive exertion he needs. Umakum seda sharabanan, but we're not going to consider a distraction from his simchas yontiv if he's involved in preventing a loss. When you're preventing a loss, that's not considered a tircha yisera, some sort of staring you from thinking and focusing on simchas yontiv. And therefore, let's say, for example, ein lo mayochal. If it's ein lo mayochal, and he needs the work, for example, the poel who now wants to be hired on Chol Moed so that he could receive wages and use these wages to buy food for Moed, in such a case, that's not considered a tircha yisera. That's not a tircha yisera. He's thrilled to exert himself in that work so that he can make the wages, earn the money that he needs to buy for simchas yontiv. So don't tell me that if we allow schar pu'ul on Chol Moed, that's going to have an implication for Erev Pesach, because our basa, that's a whole different mechayev, a whole different osir. The osir is mishum tzarich yontifu. We want him to be dedicated to prepare for the yontif, to prepare his matzahs and his morah and his charosas and his haggados and his tables and his chairs and whatever he needs. And therefore he should not be distracted. But midi the tzarich yontif shor rabbanon, if something could enhance yontif, then it's going to be mutter. For example, if somebody has to take a haircut for yontif because he wasn't able to take one. Or, for example, he wasn't able to launder his clothing. He just got out of jail. Or in certain cases, sewing and so forth, sewing. These are necessary in order for tzarech yontif. And therefore, it's mutter on Erev Pesach. Meaning the lav litzarech yontif lo shari rabbanan. They're not going to be matir something that's not litzarech yontif. So if a person does not have enough food to buy, enough money to buy food for yontif, and he wants to hire himself out, and we found that on Chol Moed that's mutter, that doesn't mean therefore it should be mutter on Chol Moed, on Erev Pesach. Because in Erev Pesach, we're only going to be matir and tzarich yontif. So therefore, we cannot take this equation between Chol Moed and Pesach to an extreme. We can use Chol Moed to shed a light on tzarchei Moed, like, for example, the three categories of crafts that we mentioned, with launderers and barbers and sewers and so forth and so on. Okay, so that's called litzarech yontif. But other kinds of work, you want to tell me that building a building should be mutter on Erev Pesach. That doesn't make any sense at all. Because, you want to build a building, that's very nice, but I don't know if it's tzarchei Moed. Maybe it could be tzarchei Moed. Or, for example, you're allowed to write a shtar in the case of Kiddushin and Gittin and Chofrin on Chol Moed. Okay, that's because the Isur of Chol Moed, as far as Malach is concerned, is because of Tircha. Those are not considered Tircha. But it's not Tzorach HaYontif, so that we're not going to be able to derive conclusions that we should be matir on Erev Pesach. And therefore, if you want to know whether or not a worker, the Schar Pa'ula, who needs the money, you're allowed to do that on Erev Pesach and hire him out, that has nothing to do with Chol Moed. Chol Moed is an issue of Tircha. And when it's Litzorech Mashal Yochal, that's not considered tir. Mishnah says, "Hey, mefanami buys the vice." The subject of this Mishnah is transporting materials or merchandise or whatever it might be from one house to another. So you have a chotzer, and you have a house in your chotzer. I have a house that shares the same chotzer. Both houses spill into a common courtyard, and the Mishnah says that in Chol Hamoed we're not allowed to transfer items from your house to my house through the chotzer. However, what Rashi adds here, which is not explicit in the Mishnah, is that when you go from one house to another house through a chotzer, not only is there a tircha here, but also the public gets a spectacle of the spectators see what you're doing. And they're going to think that you're engaged in uvdin dechol, in weekday manners. But let's say he has his own private chutzner, his own backyard, and he wants to take items from his house out into his backyard or vice versa, and that's in private. No one is there to see that he's moving his objects, and not only that, it's not a great distance, so there's a very limited amount of tircha. Is that's mutter. Ein meviim kelim mibeis ha'uman. When you're dealing with an uman, people think that when you go into the craftsman on Chol Hamoed in order to retrieve vessels, the spectator comes to the conclusion that you hired this craftsman for work on Chol Hamoed, that he was fixing your kelim on Chol Hamoed. Now, he doesn't need these kelim for Yontif, and these kelim are safe where they are, and therefore to bring these kelim home on Chol Hamoed is categorized as unnecessary exertion, and therefore it's prohibited. Or what we said before, the onlooker thinks that the craftsman did this work on Yontif. You hired him to repair your objects on Yontif. But what happens if he doesn't want to leave those kelim in the hands of the craftsman because he's afraid that the craftsman either will steal it or alternatively he'll demand payment and you've already paid him, and he'll say, well, I'm not going to give you back the repaired kli unless you pay me a second. Well, he's not going to say it's the second time. Is then in order to avoid a loss of money, then you're allowed to go into the Beis HaUman, the house of the craftsman, and bring these vessels from there into your house or into a different chutz. That's all to prevent financial loss. The Gemara says the following. You're telling me that you're allowed to move objects into and out of your house from a chutz, right? Chutz to house, house to chutz. When we read the Reisha of Mishnah, we get the impression that it's unqualified. It says, is there not some sort of a contradiction here between the Reisha and the Sefer? Is it permitted to transport these objects to from the courtyard into the house and vice versa? Then why does it say in the Mishnah at the beginning of the Reisha, it says, you're not taking it from one bias to another bias through a chotzer, but rather you're taking it from your bias into the chotzer, or from your chotzer into the bias. The bias is inside the chotzer. So you're not taking it a long distance. Also, it's being done in private, and it's mutter. Mishnah says, "Ein mevim kelim mibeis ha'uman." Amar Papa Badiklan Rava tested us. because a Rebbe is supposed to test his Talmidim to make sure that they're learning properly. And Rava would ask us a stira from one Mishnah to the other. Tnan, in our Mishnah, it says, Ein Mevim Kelim Beis HaUman. U'Raminu in a Mishnah Psachim, it says, Molichin Mevim Kelim Beis HaUman. The exact opposite of what he says in our Mishnah. V'afal Pisha Einam Litzarech HaMoed. So Mishnah allows you to bring vessels to and from a Beis HaUman. V'shanina lei, and we gave him two answers. The first answer was kan be'ar basar v'kan b'chol shel moed. The Mishnah Psachim is talking about Erev Pesach. Our Mishnah is talking about chol shel moed. On Erev Pesach, you're allowed to bring kelim from the house of the craftsman, and that's not a problem because even if you'll tell me the act of transporting the kelim is a tircha, but there's no isur tircha on Erev Pesach. However, when it comes to Chol HaMoed, there the isur, the otzer is tircha, and there's a tircha involved in taking these kelim from the Beis HaUman. They offered a second answer, Hava Hava Chol HaMoed. Even if I grant you that the Mishnah Psachim is also addressing Chol HaMoed, Kan b'mamino, kan b'she'enu mamino. In our Mishnah, he trusts the craftsman. He doesn't think the craftsman is going to abscond with his object and claim that it's his or demand a second payment. But kan b'she'enu mamino, the Mishnah Psachim, even if it's dealing with Chol HaMoed, I can still justify the heter in a case of Edom Amino, because if it's Edom Amino, then it's already a Dovra Avud, and a Dovra Avud is mutter on Chol HaMoed.